Hello, comrades. RJM3 here, and welcome to my two-part special on the Cold War.
The year is 1945. While the devastation of the Second World War brings an end to the old empires of Europe, two new superpowers have risen in their place: the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. During the war, the United States became the largest manufacturer of weapons and supplies, fueling the Allied war effort, giving jobs to millions of Americans, and pulling America out of the Great Depression. With the massive buildup of the United States Armed Forces over the course of the war, the U.S. went from the world's 17th largest military to number 1. The United States led the Allies in liberating Western Europe and the Pacific from fascist tyranny. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, had raised the largest army and paid the highest price in blood as the Red Army pushed the Nazis out of Russia and marched across Eastern Europe to crush Hitler. After the fall of Berlin, the Soviets turned their attention to the Empire of Japan. The Russians invaded Japanese Manchuria and Korea, and would have invaded Japan itself if they hadn't surrendered when they did. In the war's aftermath, the Soviets established communist puppet governments across Eastern Europe. They handed control of Manchuria to Chinese communists led by Mao Zedong, giving them an edge in the Chinese Civil War and defeating the nationalists. The Korean peninsula was split in two, a communist north and a non-communist south. With the sudden and rapid spread of communism across Eurasia, the fear of communism in the West was reawakened. The West and the Soviets never really liked each other, even before World War II. In fact, most Western powers funded the anti-communist White Army during the Russian Civil War back in the 1920s. The Western Allies and the Soviet Union really only worked together because they had a common enemy. And now that that enemy was gone, the mutual distrust returned, and stronger than before. The Cold War had begun. The Cold War was essentially the ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. Capitalism is the political and economic system where the economy is free and unregulated by the state. Businesses and property are privately owned by citizens, and the people are free to make something of themselves and move up the class pyramid. Communism is the political and economic system where the economy and all businesses are regulated and owned by the state. There is no private property, and all wealth is distributed equally amongst the people to create a classless utopia where no one goes hungry. Well, theoretically at least. While communism might sound tempting on paper, in reality the end result is always the same: an authoritarian regime taking control, the people being stripped of their basic human rights, and mass starvation. Now, it'd be wrong of me to deny that there is anyone out there struggling to get by under capitalism, but that is nothing when compared to the overwhelming amounts of human suffering under communism. Anyway, the United States and its allies feared the Soviet Union was going to spread communism across the world, while the Soviet Union and its puppets feared the West was plotting against them. The fears of both sides, of course, were indeed valid. But while the two powers hated each other immensely, neither side ever declared war, because of MAD, or mutually assured destruction. The US and USSR developed the atomic bomb in 1945 and 1949 respectively, so if there ever was a war, it'd be a nuclear one. NATO and the Warsaw Pact would throw their entire nuclear arsenals at each other, wiping out the entire populations of both sides and ending the world. Going to war was simply not an option. If the US and USSR wanted to fight each other, it would have to be indirectly through proxies, spies, and better tech. And after 4 decades of proxy wars, espionage, and technological advances, the United States came out on top when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, allowing the United States to become the world's sole superpower. But what if in an alternate timeline, the West fell to communism? What if the Soviet Union won the Cold War? Now, this scenario is rather tricky. You see, the Cold War was not such a close race. Despite the communist victories in Asia, Latin America, Africa, and space, none of it prevented the USSR's collapse. At no point in our timeline did the Soviets ever even come close to winning. If the Soviets are to succeed, not only do we need to ramp up the spread of communism even further, We need to resolve the problems that caused the collapse of the Soviet Union and create new problems to further destabilize the West. So unlike all my previous videos, which only required 1 or 2 divergence points, we are going to need several for this scenario to work.
In this two-part special, we are going to determine what events could have gone differently to give global dominance to the USSR. Let's begin.
We begin on June 25th, 1950. North Korea, under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, invades South Korea to unite the country under his regime. Following the invasion, the UN Security Council met in an emergency session and proposed a resolution to intervene in the conflict on behalf of South Korea. The Security Council voted in favor of the resolution unanimously, but the Soviet Union had the power to veto the resolution and prevent any intervention to stop the North Koreans. However, the Soviets had been boycotting the Security Council since January to protest the UN's refusal to give the People's Republic of China a seat on the Security Council. Because of the Soviets' absence, the resolution was put into effect, and the US, among other Western Bloc nations, were able to save South Korea.
This was literally the only time the UN was ever effective.
After this, the Soviets quickly realized that they kinda screwed up and ended the boycott, but it was too late. The UN were able to liberate South Korea and were on the verge of destroying North Korea until the Chinese came to bail them out, ending the Korean War in a stalemate in 1953. But what if the Soviet boycott never happened? This, of course, is the initial point of divergence of our alternate timeline. If the Soviet Union never boycotted the Security Council, they would have certainly vetoed the resolution, making American intervention in Korea impossible. By the end of the year, the North completes their conquest of the South, and the peninsula is united under the Kim regime. This is a major morale blow to the West, who could only watch helplessly. South Korea actually isn't the only nation that suffers from the Soviet veto. Remember earlier when I said the Chinese had to save the North Koreans in our timeline? Well, that decision came at a cost. In 1949, after what remained of the Chinese nationalist forces fled to Taiwan, the communists back on the mainland had been planning an invasion of the island to finish off the nationalists. When the US intervened in Korea and American forces got closer and closer to the Chinese border, the PRC had to divert most of their troops to Korea. Their plans to invade Taiwan were delayed and eventually scrapped altogether, allowing the Republic of China to survive to the present. But in this timeline, since the Chinese never have to commit to North Korea, they are free to wipe out the last remnants of the nationalists. 1953. Joseph Stalin dies and is eventually replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. The death of Stalin was the beginning of a rift between Russia and China known as the Sino-Soviet Split. Other causes for the split were the Soviets' disapproval of Mao's poorly named Great Leap Forward, and Khrushchev wanted to ease relations with the West, while Mao wanted to be more confrontational. The differences between Marxism and Maoism only grew until it finally fractured Russian and Chinese relations. China left the Eastern Bloc, gave the USSR another enemy, and put more strain on the Soviet military. In this alternate timeline, the Sino-Soviet split never happens. This could be avoided by Khrushchev and Mao renewing the Treaty of Friendship originally signed in 1950. To further assert this, Khrushchev will have to make like Blizzard in the NBA and suck up to China, agreeing to adopt a more aggressive foreign policy. Japan, 1960. The Japanese Socialist Party was then being led by Inajiro Asanuma. On October 12th, Asanuma was assassinated by Japanese nationalist Otoya Yamaguchi, who literally just ran up to him and stabbed him in the torso with a katana on live television. Following Asanuma's death, the Socialist Party split apart and lost popularity. In this alternate timeline, however, Yamaguchi's assassination attempt fails, allowing Asanuma to keep the Socialist Party together. This change will have greater importance later on. The next crucial change comes in late 1962. In our timeline, U.S. President John F. Kennedy was reluctant to get the U.S. involved in the Vietnam War for the duration of his presidency. But in this alternate timeline, following the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy decides that America should get involved in the conflict. Marines arrive in South Vietnam in early 1963, 2 years sooner than our own timeline. November 22nd, 1963. On this date in actual history, JFK was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. But in this alternate timeline, JFK survives. While at first glance Kennedy surviving might seem like an objectively positive thing, but you'd be wrong.
But before I explain why, I want to make it clear that I am not denying the Kennedy assassination was a tragedy, nor am I suggesting that Kennedy deserved to die. What I am saying is that in hindsight, the assassination might have actually saved America some trouble later on.
If JFK was never assassinated, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, would have never become president. This is a problem because Johnson had better relations with Congress and the political experience needed to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act was a landmark achievement that outlawed all discrimination in the United States based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin, and finally put an end to practices like segregation. But if Kennedy was still in charge, Congress would only get in his way, delaying the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and it's possible that he wouldn't have been able to pass the act by the election in November. In this alternate 1964 election, the Democrats still have to go up against Republican candidate Barry Goldwater. In our timeline, Goldwater was beaten by LBJ rather decisively. This was because the Civil Rights Act introduced a new wave of African American voters with high support for Johnson. The death of Kennedy also played a part in Johnson's victory because it created a martyr for the Democratic Party, and since Johnson had adopted many of the same views as Kennedy, this put Republicans in the awkward situation of going up against the policies of a slain politician. But with Kennedy surviving and failing to pass the Civil Rights Act in time, those advantages disappear. Those two problems by themselves, however, would not have likely been enough to stop the Democrats from winning by a smaller margin. However, due to Kennedy also getting America involved in an unpopular war in Vietnam, it's now enough to turn the tide and let Goldwater win the election. Now there are some things you have to know about Barry Goldwater. While he did support earlier civil rights legislation, he saw the Civil Rights Act as an overreach of federal power and wanted the issue to be left up to the states. So if he became president, he likely would have dropped the bill, increasing racial tensions and divisions in the country. Goldwater also didn't like that America was spending so much money sending arms and supplies to Israel, so he cuts their funding. The most crucial of Goldwater's policies, however, was a rather liberal use of nuclear weapons. During his campaign, Goldwater actually advocated for tactical atomic strikes in Vietnam. Now that Goldwater is president, and since the people now want a quick end to the war in Vietnam, he has both the authority and the excuse to do so. In 1965, the U.S. military dropped small tactical atomic bombs on military targets in North Vietnam. The communist powers are absolutely shocked. The bombings, however, do not win the war. Instead, the Soviet Union responds by giving nuclear weapons to the North Vietnamese. This completely screws up the situation, stunting any ability for the U.S. to bomb or conduct any retaliation against the North Vietnamese. As this is going on, a counterculture movement begins to grow in America. A large movement of America's youth demanding an end to U.S. involvement in Vietnam and nuclear disarmament. However, these aren't the peaceful flower power hippies of our timeline. These alternate hippies have a more assertive approach. Rioting, looting, and assault. Not only are they radical in their actions, but also in their beliefs. In our timeline, while the hippies were against fighting the communists, they never outright supported communism. Well, most of them at least. But this alternate hippie movement is full of hardcore, militant communists. So basically a 1960s Antifa. This group constantly clashes with police and the National Guard, further destabilizing the country. Back across the Pacific, the nuclear-armed North Vietnam forces the United States to pull out of the conflict in 1966. South Vietnam unsurprisingly surrenders shortly afterwards. Now, like I said back in my Vietnam video, one of the main reasons the USA got involved in the Vietnam War was the domino theory, which claimed that if South Vietnam fell to communism, the whole of Southeast Asia would fall to communism. After South Vietnam fell in our timeline, the domino theory was disproven, with communism only spreading to Laos and Cambodia and nowhere else. But in this alternate timeline, the domino theory instead turns out to be true. After the Vietnam War, the nations of Southeast Asia all fall to communism one by one in rapid succession. At first it's just Laos and Cambodia, then Thailand, Burma, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and finally, the Philippines. This disaster kills Goldwater's chances at re-election. Also, because Goldwater cut funding to Israel, Israel loses the Six-Day War, causing its dissolution. So yeah, that also makes him look bad. In 1968, Goldwater loses re-election to Democratic Senator Eugene McCarthy, not to be confused with Joseph McCarthy. Eugene McCarthy actually ends up doing an okay job, finally passing the Civil Rights Act, but not without pissing off the Deep South. 1969. Ever since the launch of Sputnik in 1957, the US and USSR have been trying to outmatch each other in space technology. Both sides have their eyes on the finish line, the moon. July 16th, the United States launches Apollo 11. This was America's gambit to finally be the first to land on the moon. The crew of Apollo 11 were astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. 4 days later, on July 20th, the Apollo lunar module landed, and Neil Armstrong became the first man on the moon, ending the space race. However, the mission was plagued with issues and nearly ended in disaster on multiple occasions. In this alternate timeline, Apollo 11 isn't so lucky. The module crashes onto the lunar surface, killing both Armstrong and Aldrin, becoming an infamous tragedy that shakes the nation.
And this is where we're ending part 1. Be sure to keep an eye out for part 2, which I'm gonna try to complete next month. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. This has been RJM3, Alternate Historian. Have a nice day.